1963. Brittany had just spoke about women and their oppression back in that time too. But I had 1963, which there wasn't much going on besides the movement with segregation and desegregation. There's a lot going on back then. The main guys that had the biggest influences were Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy, he arrived in Dallas with the First Lady at Love Field. The presidential motorcade leaves for a 45-minute trip downtown where the president is scheduled to give a speech to the Citizens Council. They're riding in an open-top limousine, and when they start to go underneath the third overpass, shots ring out. The first shot ended up hitting John F. Kennedy in the back. The second shot rang out and ended up hitting him in the head, mortally killing him. Governor Connally was also riding with him. He was struck as well. But before President Kennedy was assassinated, he made some major moves that changed the way we think and feel about today's issues. He was the enterprising president who helped pass laws on segregation and discrimination to end segregation and discrimination. One of the examples, he ended up sending the U.S. Army to escort 9 black students into an all-white high school. And then also on June 11th, Kennedy proposed a civil rights bill which had stated to the point that all blacks should have equal rights and no one should be discriminated from any hotels, restaurants, or schools. Also on June 11th, the president orders Alabama's Governor George Wallace to stop from restricting black students from attending the University of Alabama. That night he ended up delivering a major televised address on civil rights. He said, "It ought to be possible for every American to enjoy the privileges of being an American without regard to his race or color." In August, leaders of the March on Washington included Martin Luther King and Roy Wilkins as they meet to discuss civil rights. Both John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. were powerful speech givers. They were powerful speakers when they gave speeches. Really reached out to everybody. Obviously, the president was talking to all of America whenever he was giving a speech. And Martin Luther King, when he was giving his speeches, it was usually in front of hundreds of thousands of people. But during that time when Martin Luther King was in his position, it was during an age that Jim Crow laws reigned supreme, a time when separate but equal was accepted doctrine, a time when things were always separate but never equal for blacks and whites. This is a time that blacks were not allowed in the same stores as whites, the hotels, the schools, and schools with the whites. This is what the Civil Rights Bill was proposed for. This is also when oppression was practiced throughout America. It was during that time though, when the winds of change started to blow. Martin Luther King was catapulted to fame when he came to the assistance of Rosa Parks. Most everybody knows the story with Rosa Parks, where she was sitting in the back, and at that time, blacks were supposed to give up their seats for whites when asked to, and she stood up for her own rights. And at that time, if you were ever to disagree with a white, then you could either be put in jail or beat down. To break laws means defeat and humiliation by the police and the legal system. Martin Luther King was a man that wanted to resolve issues in a peaceful way. A famous quote that backs up that very mindset was, "The limitation of riots, moral questions aside, is that they cannot win their participation." Hence, rioting is not revolutionary but reactionary because it invites defeat. It involves an emotional catharsis, but it must be followed by a sense of futility. The famous speeches that were given by Martin Luther King, the famous quotes that were given by Martin Luther King came from the famous speeches he gave. One of which was the Great March on Detroit on June 23rd, where he spoke of the greatness and lack of violence when everybody was protesting. This was also at the beginning of the year, before the Great March in Detroit. Alabama's Governor George Wallace also said, and his inauguration was titled "Segregation Forever." I mean, you can see a bunch of hillbillies and hicks the way they thought back then, oppressing. It wasn't just African Americans; it was, any other type of race that wasn't white. The couple of the other events that had happened were the Birmingham protests that were happening down in Alabama with the governor. They had staged a sit-in on the protests, and Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy was also arrested during the protest. And when Martin Luther was arrested, he ended up writing his Birmingham jail speech, which was given on April 16th, where he spoke of the injustices that were happening in Birmingham. He used emotions in his speech, capitalizing the pathos technique, which appeals to the human emotion. He was a powerful speaker because he was able to understand how to give speeches and how to reach people's emotions and feelings. With the assassination of President Kennedy, he was not around a year later to see that the Civil Rights Bill was passed. And after he was assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson also took over. At that time, there was mounting conflicts happening in Vietnam. One incident being that the Viet Cong had killed 80 American advisors. The Vietnam escalated from a civil war to an international struggle in which the U.S. was deeply involved. Meanwhile, besides all the segregation, there's also some positive points. Andy Griffith's show, The Flintstones, Mr. Ed, and the Avengers. With all this being said, with Martin Luther King and JFK, they were two powerful men that were in control in 1963. Two quotes I'd like to leave you with from those two is Martin Luther King: "A man who will not die for something is not fit to live." And JFK said, "Forgive your enemies, but never forget their names."